The dust of Redemption, Texas, tasted of failure. Theda knew the flavor well. It was a fine, gritty powder that coated her tongue, settled in the creases of her worn dress, and worked its way into the deep weariness of her bones. She had been walking for 3 days, following a road that was little more than 2 ruts carved into the unforgiving landscape. Her husband, Thomas, was buried 2 weeks back beside the shattered axle of their wagon, his body succumbing to a fever that had burned through him like a prairie fire. The wagon train they'd been following had offered prayers and a little food, but they couldn't wait. The frontier did not wait for grief. So Theda walked. She carried everything she had left in the world in a small canvas satchel, a change of underthings, a small tin of her mother's healing salve, a half-empty canteen, and a worn Bible. She was a ghost haunting the edge of town, a woman who had been erased by hardship, and the people of Redemption looked at her as such. Their gazes slid past her, dismissive and suspicious. A lone woman was a problem, a question nobody wanted to answer. She sought shade beside the livery, the scent of horse and hay a small, familiar comfort in a world that had become terrifyingly strange. She didn't have the energy to beg, nor the spirit to demand. She just needed to stop moving for a moment, to let the world spin without her. A rider approached, and the town seemed to subtly shift its weight in his direction. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders, with a face carved from the same hard country that surrounded them. Dust clung to his hat and coat, but it looked like an accomplishment on him, not a defeat. 2 young boys rode with him, one on his own pony and a smaller one perched in front of him on the saddle. He was Nate Thatcher, owner of the sprawling T-Bar Ranch, a man whose silence carried more weight than most men's speeches. He commanded respect without ever asking for it. Theda watched from her sliver of shade, an invisible observer to a life that felt a world away from her own. The smaller boy, eager to be on his own 2 feet, slid from the horse before it had fully stopped, his legs, still clumsy with youth, tangled beneath him, and he pitched forward onto the hard-packed earth. A sharp, piercing cry cut through the afternoon quiet. It wasn't the wail of a simple tumble. It was the shriek of real pain. Nate was off his horse in an instant, his face a mask of controlled panic. Theda saw it before he did, the rusty gleam of a discarded barrel hoop half buried in the dirt. The boy, Sam, had landed right on it, blood, dark and shocking, bloomed through the fabric of his trousers at the knee. For a heartbeat, Nate Thatcher froze. Theda saw it clearly. The sight of his son's blood seemed to paralyze him, to drag him into a memory she couldn't see but could feel the cold dread of. The townspeople murmured. Some moved to help, but hesitated in the face of the rancher's stony stillness. But Theda did not hesitate. The cry of a child in pain was she understood better than any other. She was on her feet and moving before she'd made a conscious decision, her own exhaustion forgotten. She knelt beside the weeping boy, ignoring the powerful man who stood over them like a thundercloud. "Hush now. Little one," she murmured, her voice low and steady. Her hands were gentle as she assessed the wound. It was deep, ragged, and filled with dirt. "It's a nasty cut, but we can fix it." She looked up at Nate Thatcher, meeting his startled gray eyes for the first time. "I'll need clean water and a strip of cloth." He didn't speak, just stared at her as if she'd appeared from the dust itself. His older son, Leo, ran to the horse trough and brought back a dripping hatful of water. Theda didn't have a clean cloth to spare, so she tore a long strip from the hem of her own petticoat. It was her last clean thing, but it didn't matter. She dipped it in the water and began to clean the wound with a practiced efficiency that belied her ragged appearance. Sam's cries subsided into hiccuping sobs as her calm presence seemed to absorb his fear. She opened her small satchel and took out the tin of salve. It was a mixture of comfrey and yarrow, a remedy her mother had taught her, good for staunching blood and warding off infection. She applied it carefully, her fingers moving with a sureness that was mesmerizing. Nate watched her hands. He couldn't look away from them. They were chapped and work-worn, but they were the steadiest, most capable hands he had ever seen. They moved with a purpose that was both fierce and tender. He saw how she calmed his son, not just with her herbs and clean cloth, but with the quiet certainty of her touch. When she was done, the wound was neatly bound, the bleeding stopped. Sam leaned against her, his small body exhausted from the shock and pain, and she simply held him, her hand stroking his hair. Nate finally found his voice. It was rough, like stones grinding together. "I'm in your debt, ma'am." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar. It was a fortune to her. More money than she had seen in months. He held it out. "For your trouble." Theda looked at the coin in his hand, then back at his face. She gently eased the sleeping Sam into his father's arms and stood up, brushing the dust from her skirt. "It was just a kindness, mister," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'll ask for nothing." She turned and walked back to her small patch of shade by the livery wall, leaving Nate Thatcher standing in the middle of the street, a silver dollar in his hand and a look of profound confusion on his face. He was a man who understood transactions, debts, and payments. He did not understand a woman with nothing who refused to take what was offered. He found her there 10 minutes later, after he'd settled his boys at the general store with a piece of licorice each. She was sitting with her back against the rough wood of the livery, her eyes closed. Looking so frail, he wondered if a strong wind might carry her away. "You need work," he said. It was not a question. Her eyes opened. They were the color of moss after a rain and held a deep, quiet sorrow. "I do. My housekeeper quit last week. Place is a mess. The boys need looking after." He spoke in short, clipped sentences, as if the words themselves were an expense he was reluctant to pay. "The work is hard, the pay is fair, room and board included. It's temporary," he added quickly, "until I can find someone proper." He was making it clear this was a business arrangement, a way to repay the debt of the silver dollar she had refused. It was not charity. He needed her to know that. He needed himself to know that. Theda looked at his two sons, who were now peering around his legs at her with wide, curious eyes. She saw the ghost of her own lost future in their faces, a roof over her head, food in her belly, a purpose beyond simply surviving another day. It was more than she had dared to pray for. "I accept," she said. The T-Bar Ranch was vast and beautiful, a valley of green pasture cradled by stony hills, but the house itself felt like a hollow shell. It was a large, handsome structure of timber and stone, but inside a thick layer of dust coated every surface, and a profound silence filled the rooms. It was a house that had lost its heart. Nate showed her to a small room at the back, clean but stark. "The boys' room is down the hall. They eat at 7. I eat when I get in." He gave her a curt nod and left, the sound of his spurs on the wooden floor echoing his departure. Theda learned the rhythms of the house, of the boys, of the silent man who was their father. Leo at 7 was serious and watchful. His father's shadow. Sam at 5 was a whirlwind of energy and questions, his heart still soft enough to show its bruises. They were wild and unruly, missing the gentle hand that had guided them. Theda did not try to be that hand. She did not try to replace this woman whose portrait hung over the fireplace, a beautiful, smiling woman named Eleanor. Instead, she offered a quiet consistency. Meals were on time, clothes were mended. The house slowly began to breathe again as she scrubbed away the layers of dust and neglect. She brought her knowledge of the land into the kitchen. She found wild onions by the creek and baked them into the bread. She made a tea from rose hips that helped soothe Leo's nagging cough. She was a constant, steady presence, moving through the house with a quiet grace that slowly began to fill its empty spaces. The boys, starved for maternal warmth, began to orbit her like small planets. They brought her treasures, a shiny rock, a bird's feather, a tangled story about their day. She would stop her work, kneel down to their level, and listen with a solemn attention that made them feel seen. Nate watched it all from a distance. He would come in from the range, expecting the chaos he had grown accustomed to, and find a quiet order instead. He'd find Theda reading to the boys by the fire, their heads bent close together. He'd smell baking bread instead of stale air. He saw the wariness leave his son's eyes, replaced by a lightness he hadn't seen since before Eleanor's death. He told himself it was a good arrangement. He told himself she was a competent employee. He told himself the knot that loosened in his own chest whenever he saw her was just relief that his house was finally in order. He was lying to himself and he knew it. Her true worth, the quality that could not be denied or dismissed as mere housekeeping, was revealed a month after her arrival. One of his best mares, a beautiful Palomino, went into a difficult labor. The foal was turned wrong, and the mare's was growing weaker, her sides slick with sweat and trembling with exhaustion. The nearest vet was in a town a full day's ride away. His foreman, a hardened old cowboy named Moss, had already shaken his head. "She's lost, boss. The foal, too." Nate felt a familiar. Cold despair settled over him. He was a man who was used to loss, but he hated it. He hated the helplessness of watching something you valued slip away. He was about to give the order to put the mare out of her misery when Theda appeared at the stable door. She had been drawn by the sounds of distress. She took in the scene with one quick, knowledgeable glance. "Let me try," she said, her voice calm but firm. Moss scoffed, and the other ranch hands shuffled their feet, uncomfortable with a woman in the middle of their business. "This ain't woman's work," Moss grumbled. Theda ignored him and looked directly at Nate. "My mother was a midwife. She taught me about difficult births, human and animal. I might be able to turn the foal." Her gaze was steady, challenging him to trust her. He saw the same quiet competence he'd seen that first day in town. He saw a flicker of hope where there had been none. "Get her what she needs," Nate said, his voice cutting through the tension. The men stared, but they obeyed. For the next hour, Theda worked with a focus that was absolute. She spoke to the mare in a low, soothing murmur, her hands gentle but incredibly strong as she worked to correct the foal's position. It was a messy, exhausting, and dangerous business, but she never faltered. Finally, with a great effort from the mare and Theda's expert guidance, the foal was born, slick and shaky but alive. The mare, exhausted but alive, immediately began to nuzzle her newborn. The stable was silent, save for the soft sounds of the new mother and her baby. The ranch hands stared at Theda, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. She had done what they all had deemed impossible. She stood up, wiping her arms with a rag, her face smudged with dirt and her dress stained. But her eyes were bright with the triumph. Nate stood in the doorway, having watched the entire ordeal. He felt something shift inside him. A wall of respect building where there had once been only suspicion and a sense of obligation. This woman was more than a housekeeper. She was a healer. She was a force of quiet strength that had just saved a life on his land. He met her gaze across the stable, and for the first time, he let himself see her not as a problem he had solved, but as a woman who was solving him. The slow burn of their connection was built in the quiet moments that fell between the chores and the demands of the ranch. It was a language spoken in gestures, not words. Nate began to leave a bucket of fresh, clean water on the porch for her every morning, a small courtesy that saved her a trip to the well. In return, she began to leave a lantern burning in the kitchen window for him when he was out. Late, a beacon to guide him home through the dark. These were small, unspoken kindnesses, admissions of a growing reliance that neither of them was ready to name. One evening, he came in long after the boys were asleep, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that went deeper than the muscles. A dispute with a neighboring rancher over water rights had left him drained and angry. The house was quiet, and he expected to find it dark. Instead, he found Theda in the kitchen, mending one of Sam's shirts by the light of a single candle. A plate of stew and a thick slice of her onion bread were waiting for him on the table, kept warm by the banked embers in the stove. She didn't fuss over him. She simply nodded toward the plate. "You should eat." He sat down, the anger and frustration of the day slowly seeping out of him in the small, warm kitchen. They didn't speak. The only sounds were the scrape of his spoon against the bowl and the soft pull of her needle through cloth. It was the most comfortable silence he had ever experienced. For years, the silence in his house had been a heavy, suffocating thing, filled with ghosts and regrets. This silence was different. It was peaceful, shared. It was the silence of two people who understood each other without needing to say a word. When he finished, he pushed the plate back and simply said, "Thank you, Theta." It felt like he was thanking her for more than just the meal. Another time, she was down by the creek with the boys, trying to learn the art of skipping stones. Her attempts were clumsy, the stones plopping into the water with a sad little splash, which sent Sam and Leo into fits of giggles. Theta found herself laughing with them, a genuine, unburdened sound that she hadn't realized she was still capable of making. The sound carried on the breeze up to the porch where Nate was mending a bridle. He stopped his work, the leather still in his hands, and just listened. A woman's laughter. It had been so long since he'd heard that sound on his land that it struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was the sound of life, of joy, and it was happening because of her. He walked down to the creek, telling himself he needed to check the water level. He showed her how to hold the stone, how to flick her wrist. His hand covered hers for a moment, his calloused fingers guiding her smaller, softer ones. A jolt went through them both, sudden and startling. It was just a simple touch, a moment of instruction, but it felt charged with 1,000 unspoken things. Their eyes met, and the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. Theta pulled her hand back as if she touched a hot stove, her cheeks flushing. Nate cleared his throat and stepped away, turning his attention to the boys, with a gruffness that didn't fool anyone. The air between them had changed. The safe distance they had kept was gone, replaced by a tension that was both terrifying and thrilling. The turning point came late one night during a thunderstorm. A crash of thunder rattled the house, and a moment later, a terrified cry came from the boys' room. It was Sam, who had been deathly afraid of storms since his mother died. Before Nate could even push his own chair back, Theta was up and moving down the hall. He followed, pausing in the doorway of his son's room. Theta wasn't coddling the boy. She was sitting in the old rocking chair by the window, Sam curled in her lap, wrapped in a quilt. She was pointing out at the storm. "You see that, Sammy?" she was murmuring, her voice a low hum beneath the roar of the wind. "That's just the sky making a big noise. It can't hurt you in here. We're safe." She hummed a simple, tuneless melody, and slowly, Sam's terrified sobs subsided. He snuggled deeper into her embrace, his small hand clutching the fabric of her dress. "Mama?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Don't leave." The word hung in the air, a fragile, powerful thing. Theta froze, her hand stilling on his back. Nate saw the look on her face in a flash of lightning. A complex storm of love, pain, and panic. She saw him standing in the doorway, and a deep blush crept up her neck. She gently laid the sleeping boy back in his bed, tucking the quilt around him. She followed Nate back to the main room. The air was thick with what had just happened. She stopped before him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Nate," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "The boy is confused. He's grieving. He doesn't know what he's saying." She finally looked up at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "I am here to do a job. That is all. I'll ask for nothing from you or from them. You have my word," he wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that it wasn't just a job, that she had become the center of their world. But the words wouldn't come. His own fear and guilt, the ghost of his wife, kept him silent. He had closed himself off for so long that he no longer knew how to open the door. He gave a single stiff nod. "I know," he said, and the lie tasted like ash in his mouth. He watched her retreat to her room, the distance between them now a chasm of unspoken feelings. He had let her believe she was just an employee, because he was too much of a coward to admit that she had become everything. Word of the woman at the T-Bar Ranch spread through Redemption like a slow fever. At first it was just curiosity. Then, after she'd saved Nate's prize mare, it was a grudging respect. But as weeks turned into months, and Theta became a more permanent fixture on the Thatcher homestead, the tone of the whispers began to change. The change was orchestrated primarily by one person, Mrs. Agatha Gable. Mrs. Gable was the town's self-appointed matriarch, a woman whose social influence was as unyielding as the summer heat. Her husband owned the bank, and she considered the moral and social ledger of the community to be her personal property. More to the point, her unmarried niece, a pale and perpetually unimpressed young woman from back east, had been staying with her for the summer. It had been Mrs. Gable's not-so-secret plan for her niece to become the next Mrs. Nate Thatcher, uniting the town's two most powerful families. Theda's presence was an unforeseen and entirely unwelcome complication. Mrs. Gable arrived at the ranch one afternoon under the pretense of a charitable visit, her carriage kicking up a cloud of self-important dust. Theda met her at the door, her hands still dusted with flour from the bread she was baking. Mrs. Gable looked Theda up and down, her gaze lingering on the worn fabric of her dress and the simple way she wore her hair. It was a look of pure, dismissive appraisal, as if she were inspecting livestock. She swept into the house, which was now clean and orderly, smelling yeast and lemon oil. The boys, who had been playing on the floor, ran to Theda and hid behind her skirts, peering out at the formidable visitor. Mrs. Gable's lips thinned. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, You've certainly made yourself at home." The visit was short and pointed. Mrs. Gable asked a series of invasive questions disguised as polite inquiry, probing into Theda's past, her marital status, her reasons for being in redemption. Theda answered simply and honestly, her quiet dignity a shield against the woman's venom. The final blow came as Mrs. Gable was leaving. She paused on the porch, turning back to Theda. "A man like Nate Thatcher," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A man of his standing, and with two young boys, he has a reputation to consider. He needs a wife, of course, a respectable woman from a good family. I'm sure you understand how important appearances are out here." The message was clear. "You are not respectable. You do not belong here." From that day on, the climate in town grew colder. When Theda went for supplies, the storekeeper who had once been friendly became curt and businesslike. The women who gathered near the church would fall silent as she passed, their whispers following her like biting flies. The rumors Mrs. Gable had planted had taken root. Theda was an opportunist, they said, a woman of questionable character who had cleverly ensnared a grieving, vulnerable man. They twisted her quiet competence into cunning manipulation, her gentle care for the boys into a calculated trap. Theda tried to ignore it. She told herself that what they thought didn't matter. Her world was the ranch, the boys, the quiet and complicated man she was falling in love with, but the poison seeped in. She began to see the truth in their words. What was she but a destitute widow, living in a man's house without the benefit of marriage? She was compromising his position in the community, a community he was the leader of. She was becoming a liability to him. The breaking point came during Sunday service. Nate had insisted she and the boys accompany him. It was the first time they had gone into town as something resembling a family. They sat together in the Thatcher family pew. Theda could feel the weight of every stare, hear the rustle of every turning head. During the sermon, she overheard a woman behind her whisper to another, "Shameless. The poor boys will be ruined, having a woman like that for a mother." The word mother struck her harder than any insult. It was the one thing she yearned to be, and the one thing they were using as a weapon against her. The shame was a physical thing, hot and suffocating. She looked at Nate, sitting proud and straight beside her, oblivious to the whispers. She looked at Leo and Sam, their faces scrubbed clean, looking up at her with open, trusting love, and in that moment she knew she had to leave. She loved them all too much to be the cause of their ruin. To stay would be the most selfish thing she could do. She would protect Nate's reputation and the boys' future by disappearing from their lives. The decision settled in her heart like a stone, cold and heavy with a grief that was almost unbearable. That night, she waited until the house was deep in the clutches of sleep. The storm that had raged inside her since church had finally calmed, leaving a desolate, quiet certainty. She packed her small satchel. There wasn't much to pack. The dress she'd arrived in, her mother's salve, the Bible. She had accumulated nothing in her time here but feelings, and those couldn't be packed away. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had shared a comfortable silence with Nate, and wrote a short note. Her hand trembled as the nib of the pen scratched against the paper. Mr. Thatcher, thank you for your kindness. You gave me shelter when I had none, and I will forever be grateful. It is time for me to move on. Please tell the boys miss them. Theta. She couldn't bring herself to use his first name. She had to rebuild the wall between them, to make this clean. She left the note propped against the sugar bowl, a stark white rectangle in the moonlight streaming through the window. The hardest part was not saying goodbye to the boys. The thought of looking into their sleeping faces, of kissing their foreheads one last time, would shatter her resolve. So she simply paused outside their door, her hand resting on the wood, and whispered, "Goodbye, my sweet boys." She slipped out the back door, the latch clicking shut behind her with a dreadful finality. The night air was cool on her hot cheeks. She didn't have a destination. She didn't have a plan. She only had the conviction that she was doing the right thing. The only thing she could do to protect the family she had come to love. She started walking down the long dirt road that led away from the ranch, each step taking her further from the only home she had ever known and deeper into the lonely darkness. Back in the house, the cold began to seep back in. It was as if the warmth she had brought with her was already dissipating, leaving the old chill behind. It was Leo who found the note. He woke before dawn, a habit he'd developed to help Theta with the morning chores. He padded into the kitchen, expecting to find her stoking the fire in the stove. Instead, the kitchen was cold and empty. He saw the note on the table. He was only 7, but he could read well enough to understand the words. Move on. Miss them. The meaning crashed over him. He ran to his father's room, his small face pale with panic. He shook Nate's shoulder, his voice a terrified whisper. Pa, wake up, she's gone. Mama Theta is gone. Nate came awake instantly, the word gone, cutting through the fog of sleep. He followed Leo to the kitchen and saw the note. He read the spare, formal words, and the world tilted on its axis. The cold, suffocating emptiness he had lived with for years after Eleanor's death came rushing back. But this time it was 100 times worse. Before Theta, it had been a familiar chronic ache. Now, having known the warmth she brought, its absence was an acute, unendurable agony. He had let her walk away. He had stood by in his stupid, prideful silence and let the whispers of the town drive her out. He had chosen the cold safety of his solitude over the terrifying, wonderful possibility of a new life. He looked at his sons. Leo was trying to be brave, his chin trembling. Sam was now awake, his face buried in his older brother's shirt, sobbing. In that moment, Nate Thatcher saw his future laid out before him. A return to the silent meals, the empty rooms, the hollow echo of a life half-lived. He could accept it. He could let her go and retreat back into the fortress of his grief. Or he could fight. He could tear down the walls he had so carefully built and go after the woman who had, in her quiet, unassuming way, rescued him from himself. It was no choice at all. He didn't waste a moment. He pulled on his boots, his movements sharp and decisive. "Boys," he said, his voice rough with an emotion they had never heard before. "Stay inside. Lock the door. I'm going to bring her home." He didn't just saddle his horse. He threw the saddle on with a fierce urgency. He rode out of the ranch yard not like a rancher, but like a man possessed, his horse's hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth, chasing the dawn and the woman who carried his heart with her. He wasn't riding to rescue a damsel in distress. Theta was the strongest woman he had ever known. He was riding to rescue himself from his own damn foolishness. He found her 5 miles down the road. She was just a small, solitary figure walking with a steady, determined pace toward the rising sun. She looked so alone against the vast empty landscape, and the sight of her sent a spear of pain through his chest. He rode up and dismounted, landing on the ground in front of her, blocking her path. The horse danced nervously, its breath pluming in the cool morning air. Theta stopped. She looked at him, her face pale and etched with sleeplessness. But her eyes were clear and resolved. There were no tears. She would not give him tears. "You should go back, Nate," she said, her voice quiet but firm. This is for the best. The hell it is, he bit out, the words raw. You think running away solves anything? She finally let her own pain show, her chin lifting in defiance. I am not running away. I am protecting you. I heard what they say in town. I saw how they look at you, at the boys. You have a reputation, a standing in that community. I will not be the woman who ruins that for you. Your sons deserve a respectable mother, not a stray you took in out of pity. Her voice broke on the last word, but she caught it. Swallowing her grief, she was still trying to save him, and that's when he finally broke. The dam of his carefully controlled grief, of his guilt and fear, shattered. Eleanor died in that house, he said, his voice cracking. She died giving birth to our third son. And he died with her, and for 3 years I have blamed myself. For 3 years, that house hasn't been a home, it's been a tomb. I walked through it, I slept in it, but I wasn't living in it. I was just waiting. And then you came. He took a step closer, his eyes boring into hers. You walked in with nothing but a satchel and a torn dress, and you filled that house with life again. You healed my son. You saved my best mare. You taught my boys how to laugh. Don't you understand? His voice dropped, thick with a truth he could no longer deny. The boys are calling you Mama because you are the only one who taught them how to live again. And I reckon they learned that from watching me. He reached out and took her hands. They were cold. I don't care about my reputation. I don't care about the gossips in town. I care about the silence that will be waiting for me if you're not in that kitchen when I get home. I need you, Theta. We need you. It was the most honest, most vulnerable thing he had ever said. He wasn't offering her a job. He was offering her his broken, healing heart. Come home, he pleaded, not as my housekeeper, as my wife. Tears finally welled in Theta's eyes. But they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of overwhelming, unbelievable joy. She didn't say yes with words. She said it by squeezing his hands, by the sob of relief that escaped her lips, by the way she leaned into him as if she had finally found the one place in the world she was meant to be. He helped her onto his horse, and they rode back toward the ranch, but Nate didn't turn down the long road home. He rode straight into the heart of redemption. He hitched his horse in front of the general store, knowing full well that at this time of morning, Mrs. Gable and her circle would be inside. He swung down from the saddle and then reached up, lifting Theta down and setting her gently on her feet. He kept his hand on the small of her back as they walked up the steps. They entered the store, and just as he'd predicted, a sudden silence fell. Mrs. Gable was there, holding court by the bolt of calico. She looked at them, at Nate's hand possessively on Theta's back, and her face curdled. Nate met her gaze without flinching. His voice was calm, clear, and loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "Morning, Mrs. Gable," he said, his eyes like chips of flint. "Mrs. Thatcher and I are here for supplies for our home." He emphasized the name Mrs. Thatcher, leaving no room for interpretation. It was a public declaration, a shot fired across the bow of the town's gossip. He had made his choice. He had stood against the town for her, and in doing so had reclaimed his own life. The whispers died right there, starved of the oxygen of his approval. A few months later, the first chill of autumn was painting the leaves of the cottonwood trees by the creek inn. Shades of gold and rust. Theta sat on the porch of the ranch house, a large wooden bowl in her lap, her fingers busy shelling the last of the summer peas. The repetitive motion was soothing, a rhythm that matched the peaceful new pace of her life. Inside, the house was warm, filled with the scent of the apple pie she had baking in the oven. It was a home now, every corner of it filled with laughter and light. Sam and Leo were in the yard, engaged in a mock battle with wooden swords, their shouts and laughter carrying on the crisp air. They were happy, thriving boys, their old anxieties washed away by the steady tide of her love. She wore a simple blue dress, one of a few Nate had insisted on buying for her on their last trip to a proper town. On her left hand, a plain gold band gleamed in the afternoon sun. It had been his mother's ring. The creak of the porch steps announced Nate's return from the fields. He moved with a lighter step these days, the heavy burden of his grief finally set down. He came to stand beside her chair, looking out at his sons, his land, his wife. A quiet contentment settled on his features, softening the hard lines carved by years of solitude. He had learned to smile again. A slow, rare thing that Theda cherished every time she saw it. He didn't speak. He no longer needed to fill the silence with unnecessary words. He simply reached down, took the bowl of peas from her lap, and set it on the porch beside her chair. Then he knelt before her and took both of her hands in his. His were large and calloused from a lifetime of hard work. Hers were smaller, still bearing the faint scent of the herbs she grew in her garden by the kitchen window. They fit together perfectly. He looked into her eyes, and she saw everything she needed to see there: love, gratitude, a deep and abiding peace. He had saved her from a life of destitution and loneliness, and she had saved him from a prison of his own making. Their rescue had been mutual, a quiet and profound exchange of healing. The frontier was still a wild and unforgiving place, but here, in this small circle of love, they had built a shelter. She was no longer the woman who asked for nothing. She was a woman who had been given everything that mattered. And as the sun began to dip below the mountains, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Theda knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that she was finally truly home.